He was offered a seat at Trump's table. He said no. And now the most powerful embassy on earth is fighting back, not with diplomacy, but with something far more dangerous. Russia just stepped in. The Sahel is on a knife's edge. And buried inside this story is a decision so calculated, so bold, that it has Western capitals running scared. Most people will never hear about this. But what happened in Burkina Faso in the last 72 hours could redraw the entire map of global power in Africa. And nobody is talking about it. A leader of one of the world's poorest nations just turned down an invitation from the most powerful country on earth, and then watched the United States Embassy publicly express its anger about it. That is not a normal diplomatic episode. That is a signal. And in the Sahel, a region that has been reshaped more dramatically in the last 3 years than at any point since decolonization, signals carry the weight of strategy. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old leader of Burkina Faso, who took power in a military coup in September 2022, was reportedly extended an invitation to travel to Washington. The invitation came with what sources described as a prestigious award and the prospect of a face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump. By any conventional diplomatic calculus, this was a significant gesture, a formal acknowledgement from Washington that Ouagadougou, however inconveniently, could not simply be ignored. Traore declined. He declined firmly. And when the United States Embassy responded by criticizing Burkinabe media for framing the invitation as a political trap, the fault lines that have been quietly reshaping West African geopolitics cracked open for everyone to see. This is where the stakes become clear. What looks like a bilateral diplomatic dispute between a landlocked West African country and the United States is actually the surface expression of something much deeper. A fundamental contest over who gets to define legitimacy in post-colonial Africa, who controls the narrative of sovereignty, and whether the old rules of Western African engagement still apply at all. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand where Burkina Faso has been and where it is trying to go. Burkina Faso did not arrive at this moment by accident. The country has experienced 3 coups since 2022, which itself tells you something about the depth of its political instability. But Traoré's ascent was different in tone from what preceded it. He did not come to power presenting himself as a transitional caretaker waiting to hand governance back to civilians. He came projecting something that resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, a language of Pan-African dignity, of resistance to external domination, of reclaiming the legacy of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987, who remains one of the most mythologized figures in modern African political history. Sankara is important here. His ghost haunts the politics of Burkina Faso in ways that are not merely symbolic. Sankara rejected foreign aid as a mechanism of dependency. He renamed the country from Upper Volta, a colonial label tied to the Volta River Basin, to Burkina Faso, which translates roughly as land of upright people. He delivered speeches at the United Nations that read today like a manifesto for everything Traoré now claims to represent. When Traoré references Sankara, either directly or through imagery and rhetoric, he is not indulging nostalgia. He is invoking a political tradition with deep roots in the region and real emotional power among populations who have watched decades of Western-aligned governance fail to deliver security, development, or dignity. That context is essential when you try to understand the psychology of declining a White House invitation. From Washington's perspective, the invitation likely represented an attempt to recalibrate a deteriorating relationship. The United States is watched with alarm as France, its closest European partner and the longtime security guarantor of the Sahel, was effectively expelled from Mali, then Burkina Faso, then Niger in rapid succession. The French military presence, built over decades as the backbone of counterterrorism operations against groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, collapsed with a speed that surprised even seasoned Africa analysts. Ambassador after ambassador was declared persona non grata. Flags were torn down. Crowds cheered in the streets of capital cities as French soldiers departed. Washington did not want to follow France out the door. The United States had its own counterterrorism equities in the region, its own intelligence relationships, its own assessment that an ungoverned Sahel represented a direct threat to European and potentially American security interests over the medium term. The offer of a meeting, sweetened with a prestigious award, was almost certainly designed to open a channel, to signal that Washington was willing to engage on terms that did not require Traore to publicly subordinate himself to Western preferences. Traore said no anyway, and the question worth asking is, why? The answer almost certainly runs on multiple tracks simultaneously. On the purely political level, accepting the invitation would have created serious domestic risks for Traore. His legitimacy inside Burkina Faso is built, in part, on his posture of defiance toward Western powers. His base, the young, urban, politically activated population that most enthusiastically supports his government, did not put him where he is so he could fly to Washington to accept awards from the United States government. The optics of that trip, domestically, would have been corrosive. His political opponents would have used it against him. His regional allies, particularly in Mali and Niger, whose military governments have followed almost identical trajectories, would have watched carefully. Is this a strategic move or the start of a larger shift? Because the refusal carries implications that extend well beyond Burkina Faso's domestic politics. The Alliance of Sahel States, the grouping formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger after all three withdrew from the Economic Community of West African States in early 2024, represents something genuinely new in African regional politics. ECOWAS had been the primary multilateral framework for West Africa since 1975, and its slow transformation into an instrument of French, and by extension Western policy preferences, had generated deep resentment among populations across the region. When the three juntas withdrew, they were not simply leaving an organization. They were making a statement about the entire architecture of post-colonial governance arrangements that had structured the relationship between West African states and external powers since independence. The Alliance of Sahel States has declared its intention to create a common currency, a common defense framework, and eventually a confederation with genuine political integration. These are enormously ambitious goals for countries that are resource-constrained, security-stressed, and operating in a region where jihadist insurgencies have displaced millions of people. But the ambition itself is politically significant because it represents a claim that these three countries can build alternative institutions rather than simply rejecting existing ones. Russia understood this immediately. Moscow's support for the Alliance of Sahel States did not come from nowhere. It emerged from a decade of patient investment in cultivating relationships with African military and political elites who felt that the Western-led international order was either indifferent or actively hostile to their interests. The Wagner Group, now operating under the Africa Corps rebranding following Yevgeny Prigozhin's death, has deployed in Mali and has extended its presence into Burkina Faso. Russian flags have appeared at the same protests where French flags were burned. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has made multiple visits to African capitals, framing Moscow's engagement as a relationship between equals. No conditionality, no democracy requirements, no human rights lectures. When Russia signals support for Burkina Faso's sovereignty in the wake of Traoré's refusal, it is not doing so out of altruism. Moscow's strategic interest is straightforward. Every step that weakens Western influence in Africa is a step that serves Russian geopolitical objectives, both as a direct benefit and as leverage in the broader contest with NATO over the post-Cold War international order. Russia does not need to be loved in the Sahel. It needs to be useful. And for governments that feel cornered by Western conditionality, that feel like every offer of partnership comes attached to requirements about governance, elections, and civil liberties they are not prepared to meet, usefulness is more valuable than affection. What happens next could redefine the region entirely. The United States Embassy's decision to publicly criticize Burkinabe media deserves scrutiny here, because it was an unusual and arguably counterproductive move. Diplomatic frustration is real and understandable, but expressing it through public criticism of a country's media landscape does not win friends. It reinforces exactly the narrative that Traoré and his regional allies have been promoting, that Western powers view African media, African public opinion, and African political discourse as things to be managed rather than respected. Whether or not that characterization is fair to Washington's actual intentions, the embassy's response handed Traore a gift. It gave his supporters a concrete, quotable example of Western governments attempting to police how African people talk about their own political choices. Voices across the Sahel moved quickly to defend Traore's decision, and their framing was consistent. African leaders do not require Western validation to establish their legitimacy. This is a politically charged claim, and it lands differently depending on where you are sitting. From a Western liberal perspective, it can sound like a justification for unaccountable military governance. From the perspective of populations who have lived through decades of externally validated governments that delivered neither security nor prosperity, it sounds like an obvious truth. The gap between those two perspectives is not primarily a gap about facts. Both sides can agree on the basic empirical picture: that Burkina Faso's security situation remains catastrophic, that roughly half the country is outside effective government control, that millions of people have been displaced by jihadist violence, and that the humanitarian situation is dire. The disagreement is about causation, responsibility, and the nature of the relationship between African governments and external powers. Traore's government and its supporters across the Sahel argue that decades of Western-backed counterterrorism strategy in the region was not simply ineffective, but actively harmful. That the model of governance and security that France and the United States promoted created the conditions for the insurgencies to grow by generating corruption, impunity, and the kind of governance failures that jihadist recruiters exploit. This is not a fringe argument. It is made by serious analysts, including some within Western policy institutions, who have looked hard at why the Sahel deteriorated so dramatically despite significant security investment. The counterargument that replacing French and American counterterrorism assets with Russian mercenaries will improve security outcomes is equally contested. The evidence from Mali, where Wagner has operated since 2021, is mixed at best and deeply troubling in terms of documented human rights abuses at worst. Massacres attributed to Wagner forces alongside Malian military units, civilian displacement as a consequence of operations, and no clear trajectory toward stabilization do not suggest that the Russian alternative is delivering on its promises. But for populations who felt that the previous arrangement had also failed them, the absence of guaranteed improvement is not necessarily a disqualifying factor. Sometimes people choose change not because they are certain the alternative will be better, but because they are certain the status quo is unacceptable. Traore understands this, whatever else he is, and there are legitimate, serious criticisms of his government's record on press freedom, civil liberties, and human rights. He has demonstrated a sophisticated grasp of the political emotions driving his base. His refusal of the Washington invitation was not an impulsive act. It was a performance of sovereignty aimed at multiple audiences simultaneously: his domestic supporters, his regional allies in Mali and Niger, the broader African public that has been watching the Sahel juntas with a mixture of concern and, in some quarters, admiration, and the international community of states, China, Russia, Turkey, the Gulf states, that are actively competing to fill the space being vacated by Western influence. The geopolitical implications of this competition are significant and still unfolding. China has been notably quieter than Russia in its public support for the alliance of Sahel states, which reflects Beijing's characteristic preference for economic engagement over ideological positioning. But Chinese infrastructure investment in the Sahel has continued, and China's long-term calculus almost certainly includes the possibility that these three countries, sitting atop significant mineral wealth including gold, lithium, and manganese, could become important nodes in the supply chains that Chinese industrial strategy depends on. The diplomatic ground being prepared now will determine the terms of those economic relationships for a generation. Turkey, which has dramatically expanded its African diplomatic footprint over the last decade, has positioned itself as a potential mediator and alternative partner, offering military hardware, including the Bayraktar drones that have become symbolically important in several African conflict theaters, without the ideological baggage that either Western or Russian partnership carries. The Gulf states, particularly Qatar and the UAE, have their own interests in Sahelian stability and their own relationships with various political actors in the region. The United States, watching all of this, faces a genuine strategic dilemma. Its historical tools for engaging with the Sahel, security assistance, counterterrorism cooperation, governance conditionality tied to aid, have all lost significant traction. Its closest European partner in the region has been expelled. Its multilateral frameworks, ECOWAS, the African Union governance mechanisms, are under pressure. And now a direct diplomatic overture to one of the key Sahel junta leaders has been publicly and firmly rebuffed. The risk for Washington is that frustration translates into disengagement, and disengagement creates a vacuum that other powers will fill. The Sahel is not strategically marginal from an American perspective. The region's instability has direct consequences for European migration flows, for North African security dynamics, and for the broader trajectory of jihadist movements that have demonstrated the ability to project violence beyond their immediate geographic base. An American strategic retreat from the Sahel, even a partial one driven by frustration rather than calculation, would be a significant gift to adversaries who have invested heavily in positioning themselves as the region's preferred partners. The harder question, and the one that American policymakers have struggled to answer convincingly, is what a credible American re-engagement with the Sahel would actually look like. The old model is broken. The juntas have made clear they will not accept the conditionality that was attached to previous American assistance. A purely transactional approach, security cooperation without democratic governance requirements, runs into significant domestic political constraints in Washington and raises legitimate questions about whether American support for military governments ultimately produces the kind of stability that serves long-term American interests. There are no easy answers here. But the starting point for any honest assessment has to be the recognition that Traoré's refusal was not simply an act of defiance. It was a diagnostic, a clear indicator of how far the relationship between the United States and the Sahel has deteriorated, and how fundamentally the terms of engagement will need to change if any productive relationship is going to be rebuilt. The voices that rallied behind Traoré's decision across the Sahel and beyond were not all speaking from the same place politically. Some were genuine Pan-African idealists who see in the alliance of Sahel states the first serious attempt to build African sovereignty on African terms in a generation. Some were opportunists riding a wave of anti-Western sentiment for their own purposes. Some were simply people who have watched external powers shape their region for decades and feel, viscerally, that the time for a different approach has arrived, even if the contours of that different approach remain unclear. What they shared was a conviction that the old rules of the game, that African legitimacy requires Western validation, that African governments must earn approval from Washington or Paris before they can be considered serious actors, are no longer operative. Whether that conviction is strategically wise, whether it will produce better outcomes for ordinary people in the Sahel whose daily reality remains defined by violence, displacement, and deprivation, is a question that cannot be answered yet. History will render that verdict. What can be said with confidence is that Traoré's refusal of the Washington invitation marks a moment. It marks the moment when the reshaping of Sahel geopolitics that began with the first coup in Mali in 2020 became impossible to ignore at the level of direct U.S.-Africa bilateral relations. It marks the moment when a Sahel junta leader looked at an offer from the White House and concluded, publicly and without visible hesitation, that accepting it would cost him more than declining it. That calculation, and the fact that it was almost certainly correct, tells you more about the current state of American influence in West Africa than any policy document or diplomatic cable could. The question now is not whether the old architecture of Western engagement with the Sahel can be restored. It cannot. The question is what comes next, whether the alliance of Sahel states can build the institutions and security capacity it has promised, whether Russia's presence will deliver stability or deepen suffering, whether the United States and Europe can construct a new framework for engagement that is honest about past failures and realistic about present constraints, and whether the millions of people caught in the middle of these geopolitical contests will ever see the peace and governance they have been promised by so many and delivered by so few. Captain Ibrahim Traoré said no to Washington. The Sahel is watching what Washington does next. And so is the rest of Africa.